Well, let's talk about the total fiscal savings that government has been able to make out of this domestic debt exchange program. I'm sure we can give us some understanding of where we are and what we are hoping to use it for, how the utilization plan, if there is any.
So let me talk about the utilization plan first, and then I'll answer your question about the numbers. The challenge or the fiscal challenge that the government is trying to deal with is that there are a number of expenditure commitments, including debt servicing. The debt servicing expenditure commitments are based on contracts that were signed with creditors a while back, over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. You sign a contract with a creditor and you say, give me $10 million. I will pay you over this period at this interest rate. So every year I'll service this percentage of it. So you have contracts. You put all of those contracts into one basket and it becomes your debt servicing part of your expenditure commitments. Then you have the government operations. So you have item one, which is compensation. Then you have goods and services. You have capital expenditure. Then you have debt servicing before you get to amortization, etc. So the debt servicing component is based on prior contracts that you have signed. Now, the forecast is that if you look at the revenues that are coming in and you compare to these expenditure commitments, government has a difficulty in servicing these expenditure commitments.
What's the difficulty? What's the difficulty exactly?
Because the revenues that are coming in. So, for example, if your forecast of revenues is, let's say, 100 billion, and then based on the expenditure commitments that you have made, your expenditure commitments are 130 billion. You then have a gap of 30 billion. So you ask yourself, how much can I prudentially borrow this year? Maybe it's 20 billion. So in addition to your 100 billion, assuming you meet your revenue target of 100 billion, you can only borrow about 20 billion in addition. But you have expenditure commitments of 130 billion. So the prudent thing to do is to go to that 130 billion and say, how do I make some adjustments or cuts to free up some fiscal space of about 10 billion so that at least you balance your budget? So one of the instruments is to have a conversation with the creditors that you've signed contracts with in times past and say, can we change the terms of the contract so that maybe out of that 130 billion, your obligation to creditors is 30 billion. Can we adjust the contract so that it's no longer 30 billion a year, but it's 20 billion a year? If we can adjust it, then by raising 100 billion, borrowing 20 billion, you can then honor the 120 billion obligations instead of the 130 billion obligations. So the conversation with creditors essentially was, or is, how do we adjust the old terms? How do we exchange some of the old debts for new debts at the new terms so that the government can honor its obligations? And that is the kind of conversation that has been going on. So the domestic side of it was aimed at helping the government to adjust its expenditure commitments to meet the revenues. That's number one. So it's not like there's going to be an alternate use for that money. It is commitment that you have, which if you look at the forecast, you can't meet. And therefore, you are having to adjust those commitments by exchanging the debts that underlie those commitments for new debt. Sometimes you hear debt exchange, debt. It's a very simple enterprise of changing the old debts for new debts at terms that the government can honor. Now, your earlier question was about...
On the total fiscal savings, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so again, just a quick correction. There are no savings here. You are only just adjusting it year by year so that you can meet the obligations. To be honest with you, as at now, there are outstanding parts of that program. Remember that cocoa bonds have not been dealt with. The dollar domestic bonds have not been dealt with. They are the outstanding parts that need to be completed. And then when all of those are settled, you have clarity of how much fiscal space you have been able to cut out for this fiscal year, and if you program it for the subsequent fiscal year. So I will pray that we give the technocrats at the Ministry of Finance some time to finish with the cocoa bonds and then the dollar domestic bills. Then we'll get a clear sense of how much fiscal space, how much of that expenditure obligation this year, next year, the next 4 or 5 years has been, may I say, cut back as a result of this intervention.
Okay.